So welcome. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, who is a professor of economics at Virginia Tech. Professor Salehi is currently a resident fellow here at the center. This is the second time we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Salehi-Isfahani. Last time he was here was the spring of, was it 2018? 2018. And he is also a research fellow at the Economics Research Forum in Cairo and research affiliate at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. And until recently, he was a non-resident fellow at Brookings Institute as well. The list of publications and other contributions of Professor Salehi is way too long for me to mention here. But I can just say that if whenever I talk to anyone about his work and his contribution, the kind of adjectives I hear is to be precise, careful, nuanced, contextualized, broad yet specific, and multidimensional. If you are in any department of economics, you realize how rare these qualities are in a department of economics. And to get a sense and a flavor of Professor Salehi's scholarship, you can go to his blog called, very appropriately, Tyranny of Numbers. He is the co-author of two books, Models of Oil Market and After the Spring, Economic Transitions in the Arab World, and as I said, numerous articles and other commentaries, both in English and Persian. He received his PhD recently in 1977 from Harvard University, and again, it's such a pleasure to welcome him in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you, Behruz, for a very generous introduction. I hope I don't get evicted from the Department of Economics with all those adjectives. It's nice to be back here. I remember, I think it was in the same room, I gave another talk. It's kind of similar, trying to get into the numbers about Iran. Numbers are very important to me because I think opinions can get very contentious. And what I'm trying to do here is to, actually, much of the work that I've done the last couple of months has been digging into past data, because the current situation is very well known. We have a lot of data from Iran, survey data, that can tell us about life in rural, urban areas. But from before the revolution, not so much. You know, revolutions are bad for many things, including data. People throw stuff away because it's ancien regime. Who would ever want to use this stuff? And I've been very sad to see some of that stuff. So. Economists have recently, in a way, discovered the importance of inequality. They talk more about economic growth. But if you went to Iran 100 years ago or before, you'd be struck, of course, how poor the country is, but that wouldn't be so surprising. But you'd also be struck by the inequalities that stare you in the face if you're willing to look at them. One was the rural-urban difference. The majority of population, maybe 90%, worked on the land that didn't belong to them, and they shared the output like half and half with the landlord. If you went inside the homes of a typical urban or rural family, you would see a lot of inequalities there. That would be inequality of gender between men and women. And then kind of superseding all this is inequality of income. As class barriers decline, and in Iran they have rural-urban differences have become narrower in terms of power. Feudalism has been wiped out. And if you look inside the houses, men and women are maybe now equally educated. What remains is the kind of inequality that we talk about in advanced countries, which is income inequality. Who has more, who has less, living standards. And I'm going to go through the first two types of inequality, gender and rural-urban. Those are not new work. I'm going to put them in perspective because I think to make sense of Iran, not as a country that is Islamic, that has had revolution, but as a country that has been struggling with inequality and still has a long way to go. You have to include those two other inequalities, but most of what I've done recently is on distribution of income. It's been really good to get away from an economics department that does a lot of regressions with the data that's already out there and poring over some of the stuff from the library here to dig up on what was living standards in well, before most of you were born, which is 1917 or 1960s. So everybody knows high degree of income inequality is not good for economic growth. But with respect to gender, it's much more clear. No country has developed without narrowing all forms of gender gap, empowering women. And that's where the contradiction in Iran is. So they have done quite a bit to narrow, for example, the rural-urban gap, but whatever has happened with the gender gap has been kind of incidental, and now it's becoming much more of an issue. During the Shah, there was very little information, very little emphasis on poverty. I couldn't find any papers written inside Iran by Iranians. One Japanese had written a paper on the extent of poverty in Iran. It just did not seem something people wanted to pay attention to, even though if you drove to the airport, you would see a lot of shanty towns and Halabi Abad, as they call it. Kind of an oxymoron, right? Halabi Abad can't be Abad with Halabi. It's tin roof houses. So one of the things you will see is that inequality was rising with respect to income. Maybe even rural-urban gap was widening, but for women, things were improving because the Shah was very much interested in that kind of modernization. So when the revolution happened, the main appeal of the revolution to the masses, most of whom lived in rural areas. Keep remembering that average Iranian was a rural person. It's only after the 1980s, basically, that the average Iranian started becoming an urban person. It was the promise of an egalitarian society, not a rapidly growing economy. People did not support Ayatollah Khomeini because they thought he would usher in a period of economic growth. Iran was doing just fine with economic growth before that. So the emphasis was on inequality. So here you have a sense, you have an instance in which rising inequality becomes an obstacle to growth. And I'm going to talk about how the same will happen if you have gender inequalities. Now, revolutions that succeed, this is kind of a punchline of this talk in case I don't get to the end of my slides. Revolutions that succeed are the ones that can take this destructive energy, egalitarian energy of revolutions and channel them into productive, constructive ways. This happened, for example, in China very late in the process. It was in 1980s, basically, that China started taking all that Maoist energy, putting it into economic growth, and they've done wonderful with that since. In Iran, this happened briefly and did not stick. So where we are right now, is in a period in which people are still wondering what's going to happen to inequality. They're struggling. Different political leaders go for reform of the judicial system, empowering women, and the conservatives, not surprisingly, they've gone to income inequality. Whether they can do something about it is not clear. Inequality of what? This is actually a title of a paper by Amartya Sen, because there are all sorts of inequalities. There is social class, gender, ethnicity, income, and opportunities, inequality of opportunities. I'm not going to talk about most of those. My focus is going to be on gender, rural-urban disparities, and on income inequality. Now, gender disparities have a very complex history, and one that I have dealt with in other work, and just briefly would mention. Infrastructure investments that come very naturally to all revolutionaries. Extend electricity to rural areas, build public baths, roads, clean water. They empower women. They empower women more than men, so they close gender gaps. So that happened. But beside infrastructure investment, there were also other things that had unexpected effects. For example, segregating women or segregating small children, boys and girls, into different schools appears to have had a positive influence on girl education. We did a very careful study of a lot of women born in different villages, different areas, some with mixed school, some with gender-specific schools, and the ones that had girl schools had 1 year more education as an adult later. So that's the kind of thing that you may intuitively think happens when you have conservative families. They do not want to send their girls to schools where they could be corrupted, being near boys or men. That's something that people talk about a lot about Afghanistan. Iran was like that some time ago, or at the time of the revolution, but this kind of segregation helped. Also segregation, for example, in transportation, public spaces, in general empowered women. Women could more easily get out of the house saying to their male elders that this is the Islamic Republic, nothing is going to happen, I'm going to go out to see my friend or go to school or go to work. Before the revolution, that might have not been such a strong argument. Now, the rural-urban transformation actually started well before the revolution. It was the Shah who first dealt a major blow to feudalism, which is arbab raiyati in Iran. Feudalism gave way to wage labor with very complex impact on inequality. You will see in some of the slides that the land reform gave land ownership to some peasants, the ones who had some property rights, but this qualified the majority of people who became workers, they're called khoshnashin, who then left for the cities with very low wage labor. Again, we'll have a little bit of information on that later on. Now, income inequality, we don't have any clear prediction for it. Iran has developed. Has it become more equal or unequal? It depends. All Latin American countries have developed. They all have still very high inequality of income. Europeans have developed, like Northern European countries, they have reduced their inequality as they have grown. So it could go both ways. I think it has something to do with the political economy of the countries and balance of power. It's just with gender that's very clear that development improves gender gaps, and without that, it's very difficult for the country to become advanced. So I kind of mentioned this already how revolutionary energy helped narrow the gender gaps in education and household production. I'll show some numbers on that. It reduced overall income inequality as well, even though they were fighting for the first decade a long, bloody war. In fact, the war may have been egalitarian because it's the poor who allowed their children to go fight. Rural areas became rural. Folk did not participate in the revolution, but they participated in the war. What made them darlings of the revolutionaries, the clergy, was the war, not their contribution to overthrowing the Shah. So that's something that a lot of people have talked about, especially Ahmad Ashraf, who is in this town, keeps reminding me that rural people did not do anything. After the war, there was a pushback against state control of the economy, a big pushback, which I think overdid it. Going to market economy when there are rents, there are competitions for university positions, highly unequal races. And then there's globalization and so on. Basically, markets are not good for income equality. That's why most governments, even in the United States, which is the most open market economy, there are ways of controlling the bad effects of markets, like minimum wage and so on. What Iranians failed to do, and here I'm not very good at apportioning blame, is whose fault it is. I have some ideas. We can talk about it maybe later. They failed to take a revolution that was progressive with respect to income inequality, to turn it into a system that would produce inclusive growth moving forward. They went too far in the direction of private markets and letting competition take its course. That's where rich people put their kids in private schools. Private schools starts growing. You may be surprised, Algeria never did that. They had a revolution. They still don't have private schools. Iranians very quickly, I think Iran has a very different kind of middle class, different kind of idea of modernization, which is not careful or cognizant about what happens to the people behind, what happens to the poor. And I think that's one of the obstacles to economic growth in Iran. And I think it's the struggle for civil liberties and greater gender equity that has now won the day. The people who typically would have been like their Swedish, Danish, social democrats pushing for better income inequality, which are Iran's reformers, like Khatami himself, for example, they were blindsided about inequality. They went more towards civil liberties, improving freedom of the press and so on, which are very important. But when you leave inequality to itself and markets increase inequality, the conservatives are there to capture that, to make it their own agenda and run with it. They're not very good at doing that, but if you read their literature, like Kayhan newspaper, the most conservative newspaper in Iran, you hear a lot about the poor. Again, it's not clear what they can do about it, but they certainly have seized the topic. And, as a way of thinking about this talk is, to what extent is it possible for Iran's middle class, for example, to come up with a different economic program that combines seeking greater equity in income with greater equity in gender. This is a long slide. You really don't have to look at it. I need to separate all these periods. There is a very important period, the 1961 to 72. I don't think this is showing very well. Iran had China-like economic growth. It's the golden period, so I'll refer to that. And it would be very interesting to see when Iran did extremely well, 9% growth per year without oil money. Did poverty decline? Did inequality decline? What kind of economic growth Iran had? Everyone who has talked about this period is only interested in the growth rate. Very little attention paid to what it did to poverty or inequality. And one of the things I think I like to do working on this topic is to shift the focus a little bit from growth to inequality. Then you have an oil boom. Oil booms are always bad for inequality. Why? Because you have an unequal power structure. Money comes from the top. It gets stuck on the top. It doesn't trickle down unless the rich people want to have their shoes shined. That happens a lot. Poor people gain. As you can see, poverty declines during the oil boom. And then there is the revolution and the war, which is a lot of disruptions. Poverty increases. There's nothing you can do about it. Then during the Reconstruction, this is when pro-market reforms come, poverty actually declines because of investments. And this is where the reformers get blindsided, because Reconstruction was good for growth. Was it also good for equity? And then comes the second oil boom. This is Ahmadinejad's big pile of oil money. It goes into populist politics and economics and cash transfers. The one good thing in this last line of the slide is cash transfers, which is something I've written about, and I think is a clear, important way to distribute the oil money, where people can see everybody's getting the same, as opposed to every other avenue for distributing oil riches. And then we enter this last period of sanctions. And we're kind of back to the war period, where top incomes are declining. Inequality seems to be declining, but it's not a good kind of a decline. You can always improve the Gini coefficient, all measures of inequality, by putting pressure on top. That's not good. It's only if you can raise the bottom that you have had a successful egalitarian policy. So let me quickly look at gender equality. These are the slides, a couple of slides I took when I was a graduate student. I traveled to Iran early 1970s. I was fascinated by how women worked, and they're here. This is the kind of mechanism for getting clean water, taking a little piece of cloth and putting it over. If you want to fast forward to today, 88% of 100% of homes, rural, urban, have piped water. Here's a woman, presumably with her daughter, washing clothes. 88% of urban homes and 61% of rural homes have washing machines. I'm not saying this as, every time I say something like this, people misinterpret it like I'm praising the Islamic Republic. They say the rest of the world has improved. Of course, the rest of the world has improved. Probably the same statistics apply to Turkey. But when I hear people saying things have gone backward for 40 years, I think it's very important to do this comparison. If you're old enough like me to have lived in both periods, you have pictures like this and you have memories. Otherwise, you only can do data. No other way. If you go to social media, you hear a lot about how great life was in the old times. Now, this is life of women. This is the total fertility rate, the average number of births per woman. You see here that rural women had on average 8 births at the height of this curve. That's partly because revolution was very pro-natal. And there was prospects of income coming. Revolution was pro-poor. Maybe your child would be somebody if you had more children. So people had many children. One of those children was Ahmadinejad, who became the president, born in a rural area. So we have very clear evidence of great social mobility. And the other thing in this graph that I think is interesting is the gap between rural and urban. There are 2 inequalities shown here. One is the rural-urban gap. Rural women are becoming modern much faster, like by 1990. Rural women a bit later. Rural decline in fertility is always very hard. The more conservative, the more traditional. There was a big push by the government to persuade women to have birth control, which has had a spectacular success. So much so that this green line is the average. For a decade, more than a decade, Iran had below replacement fertility that scared Ayatollah Khamenei into begging forgiveness from God for having promoted family planning. I asked the demographer whether this upswing is because now they're offering money for people to have kids, and he said no. There are other reasons behind it, but he didn't specify. Education. If you look at another very big indicator of inequality, you have here male and female. So this is the gender gap. The most dramatic decline in the gender gap is in education. Although fertility has greater impact. Not much has happened because of this, but the other one has really transformed women's lives. If you have 8 births as a female adult, you spend most of your adulthood just doing that, having births, being pregnant, raising kids, and so on. It would probably take 20, 25 years to have so many births and see them into second year. So the decline in fertility really improved women's lives by allowing them to do other things. Now, people have studied, I have studied whether this extra time went into market work or went into education. No evidence that it went into market work. There's some evidence that it may have gone into more education. So that's the good side of the gender gap declining. This is the one thing that remains and hasn't been fixed, labor force participation. The panel on the left shows labor participation rate for men around 90%, for women for a while below 20%, which is not unusual for Middle Eastern countries, but still very bad. If you look at what happened, this is a paper we did for COVID. If you look at what happened to COVID and compare participation rates of men and women when COVID hits, it's women who have taken all the burden. Men's pretty much goes constant compared to 2019 before COVID. Women's participation declines by 20%. What this tells me is that some of this labor force participation being low is not the restriction because of restrictions imposed by Islamic governments, but it is because of gender norms in Iran, that if there's COVID, women give up their job to take care of kids who are not in school, and not men. Rural-urban inequality, I'm going to go quickly over these because time is running out. So we talked about feudalism before. Up to 1.9 million peasants were relieved from payment of rent to the landlords, typically 50-50. The crop was shared. In Persian, it's called nesfekari, metayesh, very much the same word that they use in Europe for sharecropping, half and half. But interestingly, it did a lot to liberate workers, except the khoshnashins, the ones without any claim to the land. You know, one of the interesting things about land reform is that you had a variety of claims to land. If you were from a village, property was a continuous variable, if you like. And then it became binary. Either you own the land or you didn't own the land. Before, it was like, we have worked on this 2 generations, so the landlord can't take it away from me. My son can have it. And dependent also on your reputation, how well you were working. So you had user rights depending on a lot of other factors. After that, it became whether you have a title, just like you own a home or you don't own a home. And a lot of people lost out on that. Those are the khoshnashins. So the overall effect of land reform on inequality is unclear because it generated a lot of poor workers. It also enriched the peasants who had so-called nasal. If you were going to summarize what has happened to rural-urban inequality, this is the graph you will get. These are the numbers that I've been digging up. The ratio of urban to rural living standards, we measure by per capita expenditures, was about 2, and it increased over time. In 1960s, there is some evidence that that ratio was increasing. It kind of comes down a little bit, but then it goes up again. After the revolution, this declines because it's the urban folks who bear the brunt of, in terms of income, not in terms of lives, of the war. And the ratio declines. And what you see here and you see in many graphs is that life begins to go back to what it was. So the urban-rural ratio starts approaching 2 again, the way it was. Now, this is very complex things to unpack because the rural areas in 2022 are very different from the rural areas before, right? These are the rural areas that maybe are so drought-stricken that incomes are low. That's why the ratio of urban to rural has gone up. We don't know exactly. I haven't done the work to do that. So the final thing I want to look at is living standards. Now, living standards you could look at by looking at this very aggregate number, GDP per capita. I'm going to show you 2 graphs, both coming from the World Bank. They are very different because they keep re-estimating. Just so you know, there are maybe 10 different versions of GDP per capita. And people like the BBC, for example, they play with these. You can always pick one that shows Iranians are half as rich as they used to be before the revolution. And you can take this one, which shows Iranians did very well before sanctions started and did very poorly afterwards. This is the impact of the war. If you look at compared to Turkey, Iranians' income declined quite a bit, but then, wow, they catch up because they grow so fast during Rafsanjani's reconstruction. But if you look at some other graphs, you don't see this. And the reason is we don't know how to account for subsidies. For example, Iran was not using any natural gas before the revolution. It's not in the budget of anybody. 2022, about 90% of families have access to natural gas. And they consume a lot of natural gas. Now, GDP evaluates that at a price that's 1/30th of Europe. So it really becomes nothing. It's like natural gas doesn't matter. It's transformed people's lives. Women cook with it, heat their homes with just turning something before, instead of collecting wood and so on, right? But the GDP says that was nothing. Why? Because the price was so low. Now, this graph, what they do, it's a lot of good work economists do. They take the quantities and multiply them by US prices. So these are US prices applied to whatever Iranians do. If they have a haircut, they gave them $20 worth of GDP, not the 20 cents that they might have paid. So that's why this GDP, but purchasing power parity is very high in Iran. It's several times the GDP you get when you take Iranian rials divided by exchange rate, of which there are several. You pick the one that serves your purpose. Anyway, so that's why I do survey, because with surveys, you can get more deeply into the data. Now, this is an example of these contentious comparisons I was talking about. Alavi Tabar, who's a reformist I happen to know, he writes, younger generations, no, actually it was in video, I took this down. Younger generations accuse us of having lived in heaven before the revolution, but did not appreciate it. There's a lot of talk like that life was really good and people were too stupid to realize it. They had a revolution and ruined everything for everybody. And people constantly have to apologize for having done the revolution. Like these days, we have to apologize for something else. If you go to a website, this is a website that monitors poverty all over the world, the Borgen Project. You read that about how the 1979 revolution brought Iran into poverty, the changes that ensued after the 1979 revolution sent the nation into economic troubles of a multitude of reasons. These are web stuff you should avoid reading. What should you do? You should come to my website, read about numbers. So this survey data, I'm trying to get you to shed a few tears for my labors. And also notice that there is some uncertainty about the numbers I'm presenting. After 1983, we have a lot of micro data, individual level data. So I have on my computer several million Iranians, everything about them. Before the revolution, all we have are these tables. They created the tables, threw the data away, or at least they say. Even these are nearly being thrown away. As you can see, this one I copied from the Statistical Center of Iran. If you do this, and you get a fairly decent idea of living standards. Here I've taken a measure that is easiest to calculate. Divide food expenditures by total expenditures. Economists think of that as a very good measure of living standards. All poor people spend 70-80% of their incomes on food, or rich people spend about 20% on food. And it's so consistent globally that you can read living standards from it. So living standards are rising, are declining. So when this curve goes up, when food share goes up, incomes are declining. And this is the evidence that I've been looking for, that average living standards were not improving during this period of 9% growth. The growth was mostly in infrastructure investments, factories, maybe profits and rents, but in people's pockets, in people's expenditures, you don't see that because they're spending more on food than before. Right around when the oil money comes in, they're getting better off. They're spending, food prices are going up, by the way, but share of expenditures in food declines. And then you see what you see everywhere else. It's kind of a steady trend for living standards after the revolution. If you want to get away from averages, you want to first ask about what's happening to the number of poor. This is a graph that I'm proud of because I put together. We have to get the distribution to find how many people are below a certain line. The line of poverty that I've taken is from the World Bank. It's about $7 something in purchasing power parity. And it's the one they use for countries with Iran's level of income. You see that with oil money coming in, poverty declines. The poor people absolutely benefit from. They may lose relative to the rich, and that you can see everywhere, but absolutely their living standards improve. So poverty rates go down for rural people from 50%. The average of these would be somewhere around here, go down to about 20%, below 20%. The war, there's nothing you can do about it. Poverty goes back up. But then this is the part of Iran that's very interesting. I think it's at least as interesting in this period of 1960s that people talk about. Because here you have rural development that results in poverty reduction. And the most important aspect of rural development was the improved status of women. All these kind of end with sanctions, which is very tragic in a way, because this revolutionary energy that couldn't go into constructing a society that creates inclusive growth went into challenging imperial powers, Israel, and so on. And military became very important. And sanctions, as many critics of Islamic Republic say, was brought onto Iran. I see it as a kind of failure to do this domestic part, to do what they did in China in the 1980s. To reconfigure the Chinese revolution towards economic growth. So they went ahead and dealt with sanctions. This is the last topic. I hope to leave a few minutes for questions and answers. So an optimistic World Bank report, this is, again, importance of numbers. This is 1977 at the height of inequality. World Bank writes saying that the Gini coefficient, after rising gradually over time, appears to have stopped rising around 1972 and may even have shown some signs of declining. Wrong. It was exactly when it was getting worse. And a lot of people have blamed the revolution on this rising inequality. The Gini index, which is something people use to measure inequality, clearly rose before the revolution. This vertical line, 1979, see before that, rising inequality. You're seeing this for the first time. I have not shown this. There's nowhere in the literature where you can see this rapidly rising inequality before the revolution. You can also look at the share of the top 20%. Same thing. It's rising before the revolution. It comes down. There's not much of an improvement afterwards. This is the biggest failure of the Islamic Republic, to try to bring down this inequality to a level that will be more like at least Belgium, right? South Africa, 68% of incomes go to the top 20%. Brazil, 58%. Turkey, 48%. Iran is also about 48% now. But you'd think the class of society, Islamic Republic, would have brought it down to at least Algeria, which is 32%, or even Egypt, which is 37%. If you divide the share of the top by the bottom, you see a bigger kind of vibrations in inequality, rising very rapidly, going to from about 6.5 to 14. 14 times as much income goes to the top 20% than to the bottom. And these two graphs are pretty much following each other. So this is my last slide. I want to, or maybe the one before that, just very quickly to give you what I think is the story behind this. One is that revolution was successful in reducing all sorts of inequalities at the beginning. Then it kind of lost sight of what it was doing. It brought sanctions that undid a lot of the gains. Gender, which they inadvertently, sometimes I've given a talk, it's been like unintended modernity. Women became more educated and had fewer kids. But now that we have reached a much higher stage of economic development, women need to have jobs, need to be empowered within the family, not about household chores, which are gone to the machines now, but also between men and women. And here, right here, at this juncture, Islamic rules come to enforce hijab, to enforce gender laws. And that's, I think, the biggest contradiction in the economic growth of the Islamic Republic. Remaining gender inequalities are ideological. I don't know how you can correct them, you can change them. They probably require very subtle, very complex negotiations. Some people think regime change would take care of it. But policy can change the others. Like labor force participation is something that you can do with persuading policymakers to do something, allowing women to go out, like having daycare. That's something that's very, very ripe for happening in Iran. There are a lot of people in the parliament in Iran who would willingly, if they had money, subsidize daycares, free daycare. I'll let you look at this. I think it's kind of repeating what I've been saying, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. It would take us a while to digest all this information, but let's open the floor for questions. Let me see if others have questions first, and then we get our own people. No? Okay.
Sorry, I apologize.
Hello.
The last resort. Thank you so, thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering if I could, if you could clarify the sort of relation, you were sort of distinguishing between economic growth and gender inequality, and kind of suggesting that there's like a contradiction there because basically by not letting women into the labor force, that actually is that's counterproductive, technically, like socially and economically counterproductive. But that's like, to me, that kind of is reminiscent of like Mill's argument, right, on the subjection of women. The precise argument for basically gender inequality is, from a utilitarian standpoint, is by letting women enter the labor force. That produces value, and that's a good thing for society. But that's to me, that seems like there's another kind of historical episode, coeval one, that I was reminded of, which was like Lotta Feminista, the wages for housework movement in Italy, which was basically like instigated by the 1973 economic crisis. Because of mass unemployment, there was then a shifting of the train of struggle to the household, and the argument that came out of that was basically that the household is a site of non-value from the standpoint of capital. But actually, women in the household are basically, the capital is getting two workers for one wage. That women are actually participating in the reproduction of labor power. And so in fact, the work that is happening in the household, despite being segregated and not immediately participating in the value form, is actually still contributing to economic growth. And so I was kind of wondering if, like, how you would, just from like a comparative economic and historical standpoint, how you would like see the relationship then between the like social reproduction and economic growth in Iran, right? Parallel with what's, that kind of challenges the utilitarian argument or the Mill's sort of perspective, where the only place in which value is produced is the formal market. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Well, household production in Iran is primarily now human capital. There's no basket weaving, carpet weaving. They all become very marginalized. So you think of women as producers of human capital. That's the story of all modern societies. Human capital is the engine of growth, and women are the producers of it, to simplify it. You need female empowerment in order to strengthen that process of changing women's labor power into human capital and economic growth. A lot of research has shown that unless women have independent income, it's very difficult to do that. To empower women within the household, first of all, in Iran, you would have to change the marriage laws, divorce laws. So they have, but even if you allow for easy divorce, if women don't have jobs, they don't have a way of going back, they are dominated within the household by the male. And that doesn't go well for the child. The ideal environment for a child is parents who get along because they have equal power in a way. They can negotiate about where to live, which school to go to, who cooks, and so on. And the child then in that environment can grow better. So the perspective I have, I think, is very different from the utilitarian, for example, or the one, cash for housework. I'm looking at the net produce of the household, which is human capital. Human capital is produced partly in schools, but the schools are under the control of the parents, and you see that everywhere. Unless parents want good schools don't happen. Governments can build a school, but they can't control the quality of it.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. You made a comment about private schools in Iran, and that got me thinking about Iran's university system, which is bifurcated between public and private. And then that got me thinking about for lack of a better phrase, the brain drain. And I was wondering if you could talk about the sort of immigration from Iran, and that especially of the educated class, and what that's done for social inequality since the revolution.
Well, the way to connect those two is that, in the old times, it was getting into university. And then it became getting into a top university. Then it became getting out of that top university to US or Europe. So when you have this kind of a race, and the race is highly unequal, the poor people can't go to schools, private schools, can't go to private tutoring of English language, lots of things. I think basically all the attempts of parents is against equality. And all societies recognize that and try to control that. So people who actively try to put their kids ahead of another kid in a school, in the US, for example, I want my kid to go to gifted program and so on, they go vote for people who fund public schools. So this is two thoughts you can have in your head at the same time. I'm an egalitarian person, but it comes to my kid, I want him to run fastest. Iranian universities have put this on steroid. As a result, they've done terrible things to equality. In fact, if you want to understand Iran's middle class, look at two things. What happened to cash transfers? They hated it. Their newspapers hated it. These are newspapers that people otherwise read as reformist leftists like Sharmin. They badmouthed cash transfer because it was going to the poor. And also look at the universities, the education system. Middle class has control of these. If you talk about removing concours or reducing its impact or trying to somehow get to the poor people in Sistan or in Hormozgan so the kids can compete with Tehranis. Over time, I got into university coming from kind of a small town. These days doesn't happen. If you look at the statistics that come out of the concours, people write about this. So there is awareness that there is inequality. I once asked the Sanjesh, people who do the concours thing, to give me the income. There's a questionnaire everybody forms. What is the estimated income of your parents? And then we know exactly what happened to them. They would not give us the data. They know what I'm going to find out. One person who got some of the data quickly found out that most of the people who get into university come from bigger cities and their incomes have above average. Their parents have above average income. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much for this talk. I have a question about equality with regard to religious minorities. I was wondering if you see any sort of pattern between the revolution and after the revolution about like the distribution of wealth, the access in economy, and how they, how the revolution basically affected religious minorities in Iran.
That's a very good question. My first answer, I don't really know a whole lot. I haven't looked into that. But we know geography. We know where the Sunni areas are. We know where the Kurds live, the Baluchis live. Before the revolution, they were the underdogs. After the revolution, they're underdogs. So the question is, why is that? Is it because the revolution was Shiite-led? Or is there something wrong with these regions themselves? Some of the stuff you see, for example, the way they treat women, is worse in Baluchistan. In Kurdish areas, there's more FGM than anywhere else in Iran. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. The revolution has certainly not been very good for the Sunnis in Iran. For the simple reason, people are taught in school that Sunnis are wrong, they burn Omar's effigy and all that. So it doesn't take a whole lot to go from there to, we don't like to spend any money on their schools. So there's something like that, but it was also true under the Shah. I don't see any different in investment and strategy to try to promote Sistan and Baluchistan before or after the revolution. That's something that, most countries have that. It's, for me, is a second order of importance, the regional thing. The Mississippi is bad. There are probably places in England that are very bad. But people have decent lives still. So if you want to move forward, I would first try to get the gender inequality solved. It's political. It's not policy. It has to be that people become convinced that women without the hijab will not ruin the society, will not ruin the revolution. And then there's other things that, as I said, lend themselves to policy. I see a lot of people who can agree on policy changes about women's market work, about, in fact, divorce laws. And I think I could find the same level of agreement about we need to do something about Sistan and Baluchistan. How it happens, I don't know. As long as you have the Guardian Council and a lot of people who grew up hating Sunnis, thinking they are going to go to hell, it's going to be very difficult to walk around the hallways of Planned Organization and keep saying, unless that happens, I'm not going to work for you.
How do you change the inequality with such repression? How do you change that gender inequality?
Well, some of it has changed a lot. You saw the education thing. That happened under the same republic. It's not at all clear that, in China, women are doing fine. So repression doesn't mean gender inequality. Women could get a lot of their rights as long as politics doesn't interfere with gender inequality. In Iran, it does, unfortunately. So right now, we are getting to that. It's a very, very difficult part in the history of Iran. And I hope that somehow resolves in favor of women getting the rights they lost at the beginning of the revolution.
Quick question.
Okay. I don't need the microphone. You can give me the microphone.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you something, and I apologize if it's a little bit outside of the scope of what you wanted to talk about. But in terms of labor that comes not from Iran, people from Afghanistan, people from South Asia, assuming that there's sort of perhaps a misrepresentation or an overrepresentation of potentially male labor coming from these areas. I was wondering if that is something that you've considered in your analysis or that factors into your overall conclusions. Thank you.
I guess the answer is very short. I don't really know anything about that. But it sounds to me like a very good question. And I think Behruz is trying to kick us out.
No, I'm not trying. I'm not that repressive, Thank you so much.
Thank you.